The train whistle pierced the summer air as it pulled into Oak Ridge Station, steam billowing around the platform like morning fog. Eleanor Bennett gripped her lace handkerchief with white knuckles, her other hand clutching a worn leather suitcase containing everything she owned in the world. She had traveled over 1,000 miles, exchanged dozens of letters with a man she'd never met, and risked what little security she had left, all for the promise of a new beginning. But sometimes promises are made to be broken, and hope can shatter, faster than glass on stone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Southern Pacific Railway car swayed rhythmically as it cut through the vast Arizona territory, wheels clacking against the iron tracks in a hypnotic cadence. Eleanor Bennett shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench, adjusting her skirt to better accommodate her fuller figure. 6 days of travel had left her exhausted, her simple lavender dress wrinkled and travel-worn despite her best efforts to appear presentable. "Oak Ridge coming up, folks," the conductor's voice boomed as he moved through the passenger car. "Last stop before Silver Canyon Pass." Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat. Oak Ridge, the name that had danced through her dreams for months now, ever since the first letter had arrived at her cramped Philadelphia apartment. She removed the envelope from her pocket, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had begun to tear, and traced her finger over the careful penmanship of Jackson Thornton, cattle rancher, and her soon-to-be husband. The other passengers, a banker and his wife, regarded her with a mixture of pity and curiosity as she carefully gathered her few possessions. "You'll be getting off here then, miss?" the woman asked, straightening her expensive hat. "Yes, ma'am. My fiancé is waiting for me." The word still felt strange on Eleanor's tongue. Fiancé. A man she had never met but had exchanged 15 heartfelt letters with over the past 6 months. "All alone so far from home," the woman clucked her tongue. "You're a brave soul." Brave wasn't the word Eleanor would have chosen. Desperate, perhaps. After losing her position as a seamstress, when the shop owner decided a woman of her size reflected poorly on his fashionable establishment, and facing eviction from her apartment, the matrimonial advertisement in the Western Matrimonial Gazette had seemed like providence. Rancher seeks bride, 36 years of age, established homestead in Arizona territory, seeking companion of good character and educated mind, must be willing to assist with household duties and embrace frontier life. Photograph appreciated, but not required. Eleanor hadn't sent a photograph. She couldn't bear to imagine Jackson Thornton's reaction to seeing her full figure, her round face and ample curves that society deemed excessive and unattractive. Instead, she had sent a letter describing herself honestly. Her education at the Women's College in Pennsylvania, her 7 years working as a seamstress, her fondness for poetry, her inexperience with ranch life, but willingness to learn. What she hadn't mentioned was her size, that she had always been the big girl, that shop windows and fashionable ladies made her feel like an outsider in her own skin. She had mentioned her parents passing in a carriage accident 3 years prior, leaving her to fend for herself, in a city growing more crowded and less forgiving by the day. What she hadn't detailed was the state of her finances. That her last $30 had gone to purchase the train ticket, that the lavender dress she wore was her only good garment, painstakingly altered to fit her figure for this occasion, that the job rejections had become a weekly humiliation. The train lurched to a stop, jolting Eleanor from her thoughts. She gathered her suitcase and carefully tucked Jackson's letters inside. "Good luck to you, dear," the banker's wife said, her eyes softening momentarily. "Thank you, Ma'am." Eleanor nodded politely, steeling herself for what was to come. The most difficult part of her journey was about to begin, not just meeting Jackson, but revealing what she had concealed in her letters. The conductor helped her down from the train, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of her fuller figure, but he said nothing. Eleanor stepped onto the wooden platform, the August heat immediately enveloping her as she took in her first glimpse of Oak Ridge, Arizona. The town was smaller than she had imagined, a single thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings, most still, bearing the raw look of frontier construction. A general store, a saloon, a small church with a wooden steeple, a livery stable. Men in dusty clothes moved about their business, eyeing the newly arrived train with mild interest. Eleanor stood. Beside her suitcase, the Arizona sun beating down on her uncovered head, and searched the faces for Jackson Thornton. His letters had described him as tall with dark hair and a beard, but that description could fit half the men in town. "You look lost, ma'am." A young boy of perhaps 10 approached, munching on an apple. "Train don't come through often. Are you meeting someone?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, trying to keep the nervousness from her voice. "Mr. Jackson Thornton. Do you know him?" The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Thornton? Sure do. His ranch is about 5 miles outside town. You want me to fetch him for you? He comes most Saturdays for supplies." "Today is Saturday," Eleanor said, her pulse quickening. "Is he here?" The boy nodded. "Saw him at Peterson's store about an hour ago." He squinted down the street. "That's him there, coming out of the saloon." Eleanor followed his gaze, and her breath caught. A man was emerging from the establishment down the street, tall and broad-shouldered, in a worn duster coat. Even from this distance, she could see he matched the description from the letters: dark hair and beard, both sun-lightened in places, and a purposeful way of moving that suggested confidence. "Thank you," she whispered to the boy, who shrugged and scampered off. Eleanor smoothed her dress with trembling hands and picked up her suitcase. This was the moment she had traveled over 1,000 miles for, the beginning of her new life. She took a deep breath and began walking toward him, her steps slow but determined. Jackson Thornton was examining something in his hands when he sensed someone approaching. He looked up, his expression initially neutral, then questioning as he saw Eleanor, walking directly toward him. "Mr. Thornton?" Her voice was steady despite the riot of nerves in her stomach. "Yes?" He studied her face, no recognition in his eyes. "I am Eleanor Bennett from Philadelphia." She waited for the dawn of understanding. It came slowly, his brow furrowing before his eyes widened. "Miss Bennett, you're here?" "Yes," she smiled tentatively. "I received your letter confirming our arrangement. I came as soon as I could." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, certainly, but also something else Eleanor couldn't quite name. Discomfort, perhaps. Then his gaze traveled over her, taking in her fuller figure, and his expression changed completely. "Miss Bennett, He cleared his throat, glancing around as if searching for a way out of the conversation. "I wasn't expecting you so soon," he finished lamely. "Your last letter said any time after August would be suitable," she reminded him gently. "It's now the middle of August." "Yes, of course," he nodded, still seeming disoriented by her presence. His eyes traveled over her again, taking in her simple dress, her worn suitcase, lingering on her round face and ample figure. His expression hardened slightly. "You didn't mention your appearance in your letters." Heat crept into Eleanor's cheeks. "No, I didn't. I should have been more forthcoming." Jackson's jaw tightened, his gaze returning to her face, assessing. "Now, rather than welcoming. Perhaps we should speak somewhere more private." He led her across the street to a small cafe attached to the hotel. Inside, the dimly lit space was mostly empty, with only an older couple seated near the window. Jackson selected a table in the far corner and pulled out a chair for Eleanor with stiff courtesy. Once seated, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap to keep them from fidgeting. "Coffee?" Jackson finally asked. "Yes, please." Her mouth was dry with apprehension. He signaled to a waitress, ordered 2 coffees, then turned back to Eleanor. His handsome face was guarded now, so different from the warmth she had imagined behind his written words. "Miss Bennet," he began after the coffee arrived, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Eleanor's heart sank. What kind of misunderstanding? "Mr. Thornton?" Jackson stirred his coffee slowly, not meeting her eyes. "In your letters, you described yourself as a seamstress, an educated woman. You didn't mention that you were—" He paused, searching for words. "Overweight," Eleanor finished for him, her voice quiet but direct. His eyes snapped to hers, surprised. "By her frankness. I have worked hard to establish my ranch, Miss Bennet. It's beginning to prosper, but I need a wife who can—" He trailed off. "Who can what, Mr. Thornton? Be presentable to your friends. Look a certain way on your arm." There was no bitterness in her tone, only a clear-eyed assessment of what he was trying to say. "A ranch wife's life is difficult," he said, his voice hardening. "There are physical demands. Cooking for ranch hands, maintaining a household, potentially, helping with livestock in emergencies. I need someone robust, but in a different way." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows. She had known coming west was a risk, but she hadn't expected such a clinical assessment of her worth based solely on her physical appearance. "I have other strengths, Mr. Thornton. I'm well educated. I can keep books for your ranch, teach your children when they come. Strengths I can hire for less than the cost of supporting a wife," he cut in. "I'm sorry if this seems cruel, Miss Bennet, but I must think practically. How would you manage the daily physical demands of frontier life? The long days, the hard work?" Outside the window, a group of men passed by, laughing loudly. 2 of them glanced inside, their eyes landing on Eleanor and Jackson, their curiosity evident. One nudged the other and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Word traveled fast in small towns, Eleanor realized. Already they knew who she must be, the mail-order bride come to marry Jackson Thornton. "I've already announced our engagement at Sunday's service," Jackson continued, lowering his voice. "Folks have been congratulating me all week. But under the circumstances, you wish to rescind your proposal," Eleanor stated flatly. "I think it would be best," he said, "at least having the decency to look uncomfortable. I can provide you with enough money for a return ticket to Philadelphia." Eleanor's fingernails dug into her palms beneath the table. "And what would I return to, Mr. Thornton? I gave up my room. I sold what little furniture I owned." A flicker of guilt crossed his face, quickly replaced by resolve. "That's not my concern, Miss Bennet. I made no promises about accepting you regardless of your circumstances." "No, you merely implied it with every letter," she replied quietly. She could feel the stares of the other patrons now, the weight of their judgment and curiosity. "What will you tell them?" She nodded toward the window, where more townspeople were passing by, some slowing to peek inside. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "The truth, that there was a misunderstanding." "The truth," Eleanor repeated, her voice barely audible. "That I'm too fat to be worthy of becoming Mrs. Thornton. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." His jaw clenched. "I have a reputation in this town, Miss Bennet, a standing. I can't appear foolish." "No," she agreed, a strange calm settling over her despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Better that I appear foolish instead. The desperate woman who came west with nothing but a suitcase and misplaced hope." Jackson opened his mouth to reply, but the cafe door swung open and a boisterous group of men entered, ranch hands by the look of them, dust-covered and loud after a day's work. One of them spotted Jackson and raised a hand in greeting. "Thornton, there you are!" The man approached their table, his smile fading as he sensed the tension. His eyes moved to Eleanor, curious. "This the Philadelphia bride we've been hearing about?" Eleanor stiffened at the description. Jackson stood abruptly. "Not now, Cooper." But Cooper was already extending a hand to Eleanor. "Welcome to Oak Ridge. Ma'am, you sure traveled a long way. When's the wedding?" The cafe had gone quiet, all eyes on their table. Eleanor saw the panic in Jackson's face, the desperation to avoid public embarrassment. "There won't be a wedding," Jackson said tightly. "There's been a misunderstanding." Cooper looked between them, confusion clear on his weathered face. "Misunderstanding? What kind?" "The kind where I expected a bride who could handle ranch life. Not an overweight woman with no frontier experience," Jackson snapped, his composure finally breaking under the pressure of public scrutiny. A collective gasp rippled through the cafe. Eleanor sat frozen, the words echoing in her ears. She had endured much in her 32 years, the childhood taunts about her size, the loss of her parents, poverty, the countless small humiliations that came with being a larger woman in a world that valued slender frames. But never had she felt so utterly exposed, so completely stripped of dignity. With mechanical precision, she stood, smoothed her dress, and picked up her suitcase. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I won't trouble you further." Without waiting for a response, she walked out of the cafe, past the staring faces, into the harsh sunlight of an Arizona afternoon. Behind her, she could hear the buzz of conversation erupting, Jackson's voice rising defensively. Eleanor didn't look back. She walked down the main street, her mind racing. She had exactly $23 in her pocket. Not enough for a room for more than a few nights, certainly not enough for a ticket back east. The sun beat down mercilessly, as if to emphasize the bleakness of her situation. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country, she stopped. Miles of sun-baked grassland stretched before her, dotted with saguaro cacti and the occasional homestead. This was the West she had dreamed of. The open possibility of it now, just another cruel reminder of all she couldn't have. A wagon rattled past, the driver tipping his hat politely before continuing on. Eleanor watched it disappear down the dusty road, then turned and began walking again, this time away from town. She had no destination in mind, only the blind need to escape the whispers and stares, to find somewhere quiet to gather her thoughts and form a new plan. The dirt road stretched ahead of her, winding through stands of mesquite trees, offering meager patches of shade. Her legs ached from the long train journey and the emotional confrontation, but she pressed on, one determined step after another, her suitcase growing heavier with each passing minute. "I won't cry," she told herself firmly. "Not for him, not for any of them." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Eleanor looked up to see storm clouds gathering on the western horizon, moving steadily closer. Perfect, she thought with grim humor, a fitting end to a disastrous day. She should find shelter, she knew, but where? Return to Oak Ridge and face the humiliation again? Sleep beneath a tree and hope the storm passes quickly? As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splashing into the dirt and dotting her lavender dress with darker patches, Eleanor realized that for the first time in her life, she had no plan, no next step to take. She had gambled everything on Jackson Thornton's promise of a future, and she had lost. The rain came harder now, soaking through Eleanor's thin dress. She clutched her suitcase against her chest, trying to protect the few possessions inside from the downpour. Each step became more difficult as the dirt road turned to mud, making her progress slower and more labored. The Arizona landscape, which had seemed so full of promise from the train window just hours ago, now felt vast and threatening. The distant mountains had disappeared behind a curtain of rain, and the rolling plains offered no shelter from the intensifying storm. Lightning cracked overhead, followed almost immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. Eleanor quickened her pace as much as she could, scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. Through the curtain of rain, she noticed what appeared to be a barn or outbuilding on a distant hillside. With no better option available, she began moving toward it, each step a battle against the increasingly muddy ground. The storm intensified, wind driving the rain sideways. Eleanor's dress clung to her like a second skin, her hair plastered to her face. Her suitcase grew heavier, waterlogged and awkward to carry. As she drew closer, she could see that the structure was indeed a barn. Old but solid-looking, attached to a modest ranch house, set back among a stand of cottonwood trees. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the summer season. Someone was home. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the property. She had no desire to face more rejection today, but the storm left her little choice. She would ask only for temporary shelter in the barn until the worst of the weather passed. Surely no one would be heartless enough to refuse such a basic kindness. With that thin hope clutched tight, she made her way to the barn door, each step taking her further from the life she had planned, and closer to whatever waited ahead, be it shelter from the storm or yet another door closed in her face. The rain hammered against Eleanor's shoulders as she approached the weathered barn door. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the structure in harsh white light before plunging it back into the grey shroud of the storm. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the wooden latch. The door finally gave way with a groan of protest, and she stumbled inside. The sudden absence of rain was disorienting. Eleanor stood dripping on the packed dirt floor, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dimness. The air smelled of hay, leather, and animals, earthy and strangely comforting after her ordeal. "Hello?" she called softly, not wanting to startle anyone who might be inside. Only the shifting of horses in their stalls and the drumming of rain on the roof answered her. Eleanor moved deeper into the barn, her sodden boots leaving dark impressions on the ground. The structure was larger than it had appeared from outside, with 6 stalls on each side and a loft above. 3 of the stalls contained horses, fine-looking animals that watched her with mild curiosity. This was no modest homestead, she realized. The quality of the barn alone spoke of prosperity, but unlike Jackson Thornton's carefully manicured ranch house, which she had glimpsed from the train on her arrival, this place had a lived-in quality. Tools hung in practical, accessible places, rather than for show. Harnesses were well-oiled, but bore the marks of regular use. Eleanor sank onto a bale of hay, exhaustion finally overtaking her. The events of the day crashed over her in waves. The journey's end, Jackson's cold dismissal, the public humiliation, the long walk to nowhere, and now this desperate shelter-seeking. She had never felt so utterly alone. A sob rose in her throat, but she forced it back. Crying wouldn't improve her situation. She needed to think, to plan, but the gentle rhythm of the rain and the warm dimness of the barn conspired against her. Determination, exhaustion tugged at her limbs and clouded her mind. "Just a moment's rest," she whispered to herself, laying her head against her suitcase. "Then I'll figure out what to do next." Her eyes drifted closed as the storm continued its assault outside. "Ma'am! Ma'am! Can you hear me?" The voice penetrated. Eleanor's fog of sleep, deep and concerned. She jerked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. A man stood over her, his features shadowed by the lantern he held aloft. I'm sorry," she stammered, scrambling to sit upright. "I didn't mean to trespass." "The storm." "Easy now," the man said, setting the lantern on a nearby post. "No one's accusing you of anything." As he moved into the light, Eleanor could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against a simple work shirt. His face was tanned from long days outdoors, with lines at the corners of eyes that suggested both laughter and hardship. A short beard, neatly trimmed, covered a strong jaw. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with blonde hair just beginning to silver at the temples. What caught her attention, however, was not his face, but his extraordinary presence. Despite his simple clothing, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man completely at ease in his own skin. There was nothing of Jackson Thornton's brittle pride in this stranger, only a steady, assessing gaze that took in her bedraggled appearance without judgment. Garrett Sullivan, he introduced himself, not offering his hand, but instead keeping a respectful distance. "This is my ranch you've wandered on to." "Eleanor Bennett," she replied, smoothing her dress in a futile attempt at dignity. The fabric was still damp and hopelessly wrinkled. "I truly am sorry for the intrusion, Mr. Sullivan. I was caught in the storm with nowhere to go." His eyes, a deep blue that reminded her of summer skies, assessed her with frank curiosity. His gaze took in her fuller figure, then returned to her face without a flicker of the disdain or discomfort she had grown accustomed to seeing. "You're a long way from anywhere to be out walking in this weather, Miss Bennett," he observed. There was no accusation in his tone, just a simple observation that nevertheless demanded an explanation. Eleanor hesitated. The truth was humiliating, but she was beyond pride at this point. "I arrived in Oak Ridge today. My arrangements fell through. I found myself without accommodation or means to secure any." Understanding dawned in Garrett's expression. "You're the woman Thornton sent for." Heat rushed to Eleanor's cheeks. "Word travels fast," he said with a slight shrug. "Not much stays secret for long." Eleanor reached for her suitcase, moving to stand. "I'll be on my way, Mr. Sullivan. The rain has let up, and I've imposed enough." "Where exactly do you plan to go at this hour, Miss Bennett?" he asked, making no move to stop her but clearly skeptical of her plan. "It's nearly sunset. Oak Ridge is 4 miles back, and there's nothing else for 20 miles in any direction." Eleanor faltered. She hadn't realized how much time had passed. The storm had indeed quieted to a gentle patter, but the darkness outside the barn door was deepening rapidly. I don't know," she admitted, the simple truth of those 3 words devastating in their finality. Garrett studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him. "My house isn't much," he said finally, "but there's a spare room with a bed, and I've got stew on the stove. You look like you could use both." Eleanor stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate need. "Why would you help me?" "Because it's raining, you're stranded, and I'm not. In the habit of sending people into the night with nowhere to go." He picked up the lantern. "It's just shelter and food, Miss Bennett. Nothing more complicated than that." The simplicity of his answer, free from pity or ulterior motive, decided her. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I accept your hospitality." He nodded once, then turned toward the barn door. "Follow me. Watch your step. The yard turns to mud after a storm." Outside, the world was draped in the hushed aftermath of rain. The clouds had broken in places, allowing glimpses of a star-studded sky. The air smelled clean and new, carrying the scent of wet earth and desert flora. The house stood approximately 50 yards from the barn, a substantial adobe structure with a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. Light glowed from several windows, warm and inviting against the gathering night. As they approached, Eleanor could see flower boxes beneath the front windows, filled with what looked like herb plants rather than decorative blooms. Garrett led her up the porch steps and held the door open. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must appear and the impropriety of entering a bachelor's home at such an hour. But the alternative was unthinkable, and so she stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, a cooking pot suspended over the glowing embers. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that appeared well read. The furniture was solid and practical, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a writing desk near a window, 2 armchairs positioned by the fire. Everything was clean and orderly, with none of the haphazard disarray one might expect in a bachelor's household. "You can warm yourself by the fire," Garrett said, indicating one of the armchairs. "I'll find you something dry to wear." "You have women's clothing?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. A shadow crossed his face. "My sister stayed with me for a time. She left some things behind." Before Eleanor could respond, he disappeared down a hallway, returning moments later with a bundle of fabric. "These should fit well enough for tonight," he said, offering her the clothes, a simple cotton nightgown and a flannel robe. The spare room is the second door on the right. There's a washstand with fresh water. Get changed, and I'll have some food ready when you return." Eleanor accepted the garments, touched by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." The spare room was small but meticulously clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. A window looked out over the moonlit landscape. Eleanor quickly washed the trail dust from her face and hands, then changed into the borrowed nightgown. It was slightly large, but blessedly dry. The flannel robe, faded from many washings, enveloped her in unexpected warmth. She hesitated, uncertain about rejoining her host in such informal attire, but the rumbling of her empty stomach decided the matter. With as much dignity as she could muster, she made her way back to the main room. Garrett was at the fireplace, ladling stew into bowls. He had removed his boots and outer shirt, standing now in trousers and a simple henley that revealed forearms corded with muscle from years of ranch work. He glanced up as she entered. "Better?" he asked. Eleanor nodded self-consciously, pulling the robe tighter. "Much. Thank you." "Sit," he said, indicating the table where he'd already set places for two. "The stew isn't fancy, but it's filling." Eleanor took a seat, watching as he placed a steaming bowl before her, along with a thick slice of bread and a mug of coffee. The aroma of the food made her mouth water embarrassingly. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. A dry biscuit on the train that morning, perhaps. Garrett took the seat across from her, though he made no move to begin eating. After a moment of confusion, Eleanor realized he was waiting for her to take the first bite. The simple courtesy brought a lump to her throat. After a day of callous treatment, this small gesture of respect felt monumental. The stew was indeed simple: beef, potatoes, carrots, and herbs. But to Eleanor's hunger-sharpened senses, it was ambrosia. She ate slowly, mindful of appearances, even in her famished state. But it took considerable willpower not to devour the entire bowl. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the occasional pop from the fireplace and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, which surprised Eleanor. After the tumultuous events of the day, this quiet moment with a stranger felt oddly peaceful. "May I ask what happened in town?" Garrett finally said, breaking the silence. "I only heard fragments from Miller when he stopped by to deliver some grain." Eleanor set down her spoon. Her appetite suddenly diminished despite her hunger. "I'm sure you heard enough." "I'd rather hear it from you," he said simply. She met his gaze across the table, searching for signs of morbid curiosity or judgment. She found neither, only patient attention. "I answered Mr. Thornton's advertisement for a bride," she began, the words difficult to form. "We exchanged letters for 6 months. He seemed kind, thoughtful. He knew I was a seamstress who had lost my position. I was transparent about my circumstances." She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "But when I arrived and he saw me, my size, it became clear he had expected someone different, someone who would fit better into his vision of a suitable wife." "And he rejected you publicly," Garrett stated, rather than asked, his voice neutral. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before settling into one of the armchairs. Garrett selected a book from the shelf, a collection of Walt Whitman's poems, and asked if she had a preference. "Song of the Open Road," she said without hesitation. "It's always been a favorite." Garrett's eyes lit with approval. "A woman who appreciates Whitman. I shouldn't be surprised." He began to read aloud, his deep voice giving new resonance to familiar words. "Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road. healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me leading wherever I choose. As the evening deepened, around them, Eleanor found herself relaxing truly for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. The fire crackled cheerfully, the wind whispered around the eaves of the house, and Garrett's voice rose and fell with the rhythm of Whitman's verse. This temporary haven, a place she had stumbled upon by desperate chance, felt more like home than anywhere she had been since her parents' deaths. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. In less than 2 weeks, she would likely be gone, continuing her journey to Phoenix or beyond. But for tonight, at least, she allowed herself to savor this unexpected peace, this momentary belonging. When Garrett finally closed the book, the fire had burned low, casting the room in a warm, golden glow. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. Garrett looked up, a question in his eyes. "For reading," she clarified, "for the clothes, for not treating me as if my size defines me." A shadow of something, pain perhaps or memory, crossed his face. "We are more than our outward appearances, Miss Bennet. Some people just don't look closely enough to see beyond them." The simple truth of his words resonated within her. For most of her life, people had looked at her and seen only her fuller figure, never the mind behind her eyes or the heart beneath her breast. Garrett saw her, the seamstress, the woman who had crossed a continent alone, the person who could organize his chaotic kitchen and quote Whitman from memory. "It's getting late," he said, rising from his chair. "I'll show you where the extra blankets are kept. These old adobe walls don't hold heat well once the fire dies." After he bid her good night and retired to his own room, Eleanor sat for a long while in the dimness, watching the last embers pulse in the fireplace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tasks, new decisions to make. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future didn't terrify her. 2 weeks might be enough time to save for Phoenix, to plan her next steps. 2 weeks might also be enough time to prove herself valuable to this quiet ranch, with its thoughtful owner who read Whitman by firelight and saw beyond her size to the woman beneath. Eleanor Bennet, rejected mail-order bride, drifted off to sleep that night with Whitman's words echoing in her mind. "The long brown path before me, leading wherever I choose." For now, at least, that path seemed to be here. 3 days passed with surprising swiftness. Eleanor fell into a rhythm at the Sullivan Ranch, rising early to prepare breakfast before Garrett headed out to work with the cattle. Mornings were devoted to household tasks, cleaning, mending, baking bread that filled the cabin with a homey aroma that seemed to please Garrett more than he would admit. Afternoons found her in the small vegetable garden behind the house, preparing it for autumn planting and planning what might be grown when the season arrived. On this particular afternoon, Eleanor knelt in the rich soil, pulling the last of the stubborn weeds that had flourished in neglect. The sun warmed her shoulders through the faded work dress Sarah Wilson had brought over the day before. "Clara's old things," she'd said, with less suspicion than during her first visit. Eleanor had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and rolled her sleeves to the elbows, practicality winning over propriety. "You have a way with growing things," Garrett observed, approaching from the direction of the barn. He had been breaking a new horse all morning, and dust clung to his clothes and hair. Eleanor sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "Plants ask for little, just consistent care and attention." She gestured to the newly turned soil, now ready for planting. "It's satisfying work. You can see the results of your efforts." "Unlike cattle," Garrett said with a wry smile. "Ornery, creatures that seem determined to undo a day's work in 5 minutes flat." Eleanor laughed, the sound coming more easily now than it had days ago. "The new mare giving you trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." He offered her his hand, helping her to her feet. "But I could use some of that lemonade you made yesterday, if there's any left." "There is," She brushed the soil from her skirt. "I'll bring it to the porch." They had fallen into this comfortable pattern, brief conversations throughout the day, shared meals, evenings spent reading or discussing the day's events. It was easy, this arrangement between them. Perhaps too easy, Eleanor sometimes thought, for something meant to be temporary. She was retrieving the lemonade from the root cellar when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Through the window, she saw a group of riders coming up the main road, 3 men led by a figure she recognized with a jolt of dismay. Jackson Thornton. Garrett had seen them too. He stood in the yard, his posture alert but not yet hostile as the riders approached. Eleanor set down the pitcher and moved to the door, anxiety pooling in her stomach. "Sullivan," Jackson called, reining in his horse a few yards from where Garrett stood. "Thought I'd pay a neighborly visit." "Thornton?" Garrett's voice revealed nothing. "Don't recall the last time you rode out this way." Jackson dismounted, his movements deliberate. He was dressed more formally than the situation warranted. Polished boots, a fine waistcoat beneath his riding coat, a watch chain gleaming in the sunlight, all calculated to emphasize the contrast between his prosperity and Garrett's more modest circumstances. "Been busy," Jackson replied, his gaze sliding to Eleanor in the doorway. "Miss Bennet, I see you found accommodation." Eleanor stepped onto the porch, determined not to cower. "Mr. Thornton, what brings you and your friends so far from town?" The men with Jackson remained mounted, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Eleanor recognized one as Cooper, the man from the cafe who had witnessed her humiliation. "Heard you were staying out at the Sullivan place," Jackson said, his tone pleasant but his eyes cold. "Got concerned about your welfare." "My welfare?" Eleanor echoed incredulously. A single woman, alone at a remote ranch with a bachelor of... He paused meaningfully. Questionable character. Folks in town were worried. Garrett's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Miss Bennet is employed here as my housekeeper. Nothing improper about that." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" One of his companions snickered. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger at the insinuation. "I believe Mr. Sullivan has made the situation clear, Mr. Thornton," she said evenly. "I'm earning my keep until I have sufficient funds to move on." "Very convenient arrangement," Jackson observed, "especially for a woman who arrived in town with nothing but the clothes on her back." He turned to Garrett. "Didn't figure you for a charity case, Sullivan. And I didn't figure you for a coward." "Thornton," Garrett replied evenly, "yet here you are, bringing 3 men to back you in a conversation that could have been handled alone." Jackson's smile tightened. "Just be cautious. Your temper's well known in these parts. Only to those who provoke it." Garrett crossed his arms. "State your business plainly. My time's valuable even if yours isn't." One of Jackson's companions dismounted, a young man wearing a deputy's badge, though his youth suggested limited experience. "Mr. Sullivan," the deputy said, his voice attempting authority but wavering slightly. "Mr. Thornton reported concerns about the lady's situation. As an officer of the law—" "As Thornton's errand boy," Garrett interrupted, "you've got no authority here, Parker, unless you've got a warrant or evidence of wrongdoing." The young deputy flushed. "Well, no, but—" "Then this is trespassing," Garrett stated flatly. "And harassment." Jackson stepped forward, his cordial facade slipping. "You think you're untouchable out here, don't you, Sullivan? The town council might be interested to know you're harboring a woman of questionable virtue." Before Garrett could respond, Eleanor descended the porch steps, rage propelling her forward. "Questionable virtue? Because I had the misfortune of putting my faith in a man who values appearances over character, or because I accepted honest work instead of begging on the streets after you discarded me like unwanted baggage." Jackson blinked, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation. "Now, Miss Bennet, She cut him off, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You rejected me publicly, Mr. Thornton, made me a spectacle, left me with nowhere to go. Mr. Sullivan offered me employment when you offered only humiliation, and now you dare to question my virtue." The men on horseback exchanged glances, seemingly uncomfortable with this turn in the conversation. Even Cooper had the grace to look away. Jackson's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Miss Bennet. Sullivan isn't what he seems." Yes, the humiliation of the scene in the cafe burned fresh in her memory, in front of half the town. In the cafe, Garrett concluded, his expression darkening slightly. It seemed Garrett had indeed heard quite a bit, but Eleanor didn't press. Her situation was precarious enough without involving herself in local dynamics. "In any case," she continued, "I found myself with nowhere to go and very little money. I walked until the storm caught me, and your barn seemed the safest option." 4 miles in those shoes, Garrett observed, glancing at her worn boots drying by the fire. "That couldn't have been easy." Eleanor managed a wan smile. "I've endured worse." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than she intended, because Garrett's expression softened with recognition, the understanding of someone who had also weathered life's harsher seasons. "What will you do now?" he asked after a moment. It was the question Eleanor had been avoiding since walking out of that cafe, the question that loomed like a mountain before her, impossible to scale. "I don't know," she admitted, the words painful in their honesty. "I have $23 to my name. Not enough for a room, certainly not enough for a ticket back east, and there's nothing to return to anyway." She hadn't meant to reveal quite so much, but exhaustion had lowered her defenses. She straightened her shoulders, unwilling to appear as destitute as she felt. "I'll find work, I suppose. I'm well educated. Perhaps someone in town needs a seamstress or—" "Not in Oakridge," Garrett interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than unkind. "The only women's work to be had is at the saloon or taking in laundry for the miners, and after today you'll find few willing to hire you." "Because I was rejected?" Eleanor asked, incredulous. "Because people take Thornton's word as gospel around—" "Here," Garrett replied. "He's on the town council, has the ear of the mayor. If he says you're not good enough for him, folks will wonder why they should think differently." The unfairness of it stung. "I've done nothing wrong except fail to meet his standards of physical beauty." "That's enough for some," Garrett said with a grimace. "And scandal is the lifeblood of small towns." Eleanor pushed her empty bowl away, the reality of her situation settling over her like a shroud. "Then I'll go elsewhere. Phoenix, perhaps." "With $23 and no references." Garrett's voice remained gentle, despite the bluntness of his words. "Miss Bennet, I don't mean to be unkind, but I've lived out here long enough to know how quickly the West devours the unprepared." "What would you have me do, then?" Eleanor asked, a flash of anger finally breaking through her careful composure. "Beg on the streets, sell myself. I survived Philadelphia's textile factories and boarding houses. I'll survive this too." Instead of bristling at her tone, Garrett seemed to approve of the spark of defiance. "I have no doubt you would," he said. "But there's a third option you haven't considered." Eleanor regarded him warily. "And what might that be?" "I need help around the ranch," he said simply. "The house, the accounts, the correspondence with buyers. I've been managing alone since my foreman left, but it's wearing me thin. I can offer you the spare room, meals, and a small wage until you decide what you want to do next." Eleanor stared at him, searching for the trap in his offer. "You're proposing to hire me? As what exactly?" "As a housekeeper, if you like, or a ranch assistant, or both. I'm not particular about titles, just results. Why would you do this? You don't know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you walked 4 miles in a storm, rather than stay where you weren't wanted. I know you fell asleep in a strange barn, rather than compromise your principles. and I know that Jackson Thornton is a fool who values appearances over substance." He rose and collected their empty bowls, carrying them to a wash basin near the kitchen area. "The offer stands for 2 weeks. You can rest, recover your strength, and consider your options. After that, if you want to leave, I'll drive you to Phoenix myself and give you enough to secure lodgings while you look for work." Eleanor was speechless. After a day of cruelty and rejection, this unexpected kindness was almost harder to bear. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Sullivan," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "It's not charity. It's an exchange. Your work for room, board, and wages. Nothing more, nothing less." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. Outside, an owl called, its mournful cry punctuating the night stillness. Eleanor considered her options, which were, in truth, virtually non-existent. 2 weeks, she said at last, to determine if the arrangement suits us both." Garrett nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Agreed." He showed her back to the spare room, providing an extra blanket against the night's chill and a candle for light. "Sleep as late as you need," he said. "I'll be out checking the cattle in the morning, but there's bread and preserves in the pantry. For breakfast." As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him. "Mr. Sullivan?" He paused in the doorway, looking back. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not many would have done what you did tonight." A shadow of something, sadness perhaps, or memory, crossed his face. "Get some rest, Miss Bennet. Tomorrow's soon enough to face the world again." With that, he closed the door softly, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the patchwork quilt. 2 weeks, 14 days to decide her future, to determine if this unexpected haven was truly what it appeared to be. As she extinguished the candle and lay down, she found herself thinking not of Jackson Thornton's cruel rejection, but of Garrett. Sullivan's blue eyes that had seen her not as a disappointment to be dismissed or a woman to be exploited, but as a human being worthy of basic dignity. Outside, the last remnants of the storm passed, and the Arizona sky cleared to reveal a tapestry of stars. Eleanor Bennet, mail-order bride no longer, drifted into the first peaceful sleep she had known in months, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, but for the moment at least, safe from the storm. Morning arrived with the soft golden light of late summer filtering through the curtains of Eleanor's room and gently drawing her from restless sleep. She had spent much of the night turning over Garrett's unexpected offer in her mind, weighing possibilities against practicalities, examining her own heart with unflinching honesty. She dressed carefully in her own clothes, now dry but still bearing the wrinkles and stains of yesterday's ordeal. Today would require all her composure, whatever decisions were made. The kitchen was empty when she emerged, though the stove still held embers from an earlier fire. A note on the table in Garrett's handwriting explained his absence. "Gone to check the south pasture. Back by noon. Help yourself to breakfast." Eleanor was grateful for the temporary solitude. It gave her time to think, to prepare herself for whatever the day might bring. She stoked the fire, put coffee on to brew, and set about making a hearty breakfast that would keep until his return. As she worked, she took in the details of the house that she had been too exhausted to notice the night before. Unlike the sparse, utilitarian space she had expected from a bachelor rancher, Garrett's home showed evidence of refined taste. Not ostentatious like she imagined Thornton's to be, but thoughtfully appointed. The bookshelves contained an eclectic mix of practical ranching manuals alongside classics of literature and philosophy. A desk in the corner held neat stacks of correspondence and ledgers. Several landscape paintings adorned the walls, depicting the rugged beauty of the Arizona territory with obvious skill. Eleanor was examining one particularly striking painting of a desert sunset when a sharp knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, uncertain whether to answer in Garrett's absence. The knock came again, more insistent. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door to find a woman in her 50s standing on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's appearance in one sweeping glance. "So it's true," the woman said without preamble. "Sullivan's taken in Thornton's cast-off." Eleanor stiffened but held her ground. "I beg your pardon?" The woman stepped inside uninvited, closing the door behind her. "News travels fast around these parts. Everyone's talking about how you showed up on Jackson Thornton's doorstep with nothing but a suitcase, got yourself rejected, and somehow ended up at the Sullivan Ranch before sundown." She crossed her arms, studying Eleanor critically. That didn't take long. Heat flooded Eleanor's face, partly from embarrassment, partly from anger at the insinuation. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Mrs. Sarah Wilson. I do the washing for most of the ranches here, including this one." Her expression softened slightly. "Known Garrett Sullivan since he came out west, which is why I'm here to warn you." "Warn me?" Eleanor echoed. "Garrett's a good man. Too good sometimes. Takes in strays of all sorts, lost ranch hands, drifters down on their luck. He's got a soft heart beneath that stoic exterior." She leaned closer. "But be clear about one thing, Miss Bennett. This town won't take kindly to impropriety. You being here alone with an unmarried man—" "Mrs. Wilson," Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm despite her racing pulse. "Whatever you've heard is undoubtedly distorted. Mr. Sullivan offered me temporary employment as his housekeeper after I was caught in yesterday's storm. It's a business arrangement, nothing more." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Is that what he told you?" "It's what we agreed upon," Eleanor replied, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. "For 2 weeks, after which I'll likely continue to Phoenix." Sarah looked pointedly at the robe draped over a nearby chair, the one Eleanor had worn the night before. "That's Clara's robe, his sister's." She stopped herself. "Not my place to say. Point is, Garrett doesn't let just anyone wear her things." Eleanor set down her dishcloth, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mr. Sullivan kindly lent me these until my own could be properly laundered. I'd hardly call that inappropriate." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're not what I expected." "And what did you expect, Mrs. Wilson?" "Someone looking to take advantage," she gestured vaguely. "Pretty girl, desperate circumstances, wealthy rancher. Wouldn't be the first time that story played out badly." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a grudging respect for the woman's bluntness. "I assure you I have no designs on Mr. Sullivan or his property. As soon as I've earned enough for passage to Phoenix, I'll be on my way." Sarah's expression changed subtly, something like approval flickering in her eyes. "Well then, since you're here and cleaning anyway, I've brought Garrett's washing." She indicated a basket by the door that Eleanor hadn't noticed. "Where shall I put it?" The swift change in tone was disorienting, but Eleanor recovered quickly. "I'll take care of it. Thank you for bringing it along." Sarah nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Garrett prefers his shirts hung to dry, not folded wet. Says they wrinkle less that way." With that peculiar piece of advice, she departed, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts once more. She returned to her cleaning with renewed vigor, as if scrubbing the floors could somehow erase the town's gossip. By the time Garrett returned, the main living areas were spotless. His washing was hanging on the line outside, and Eleanor had started preparing a stew for the evening meal, using ingredients she'd found in the root cellar. "You've been busy," he observed, as he removed his hat and coat and hung them by the door. His eyes took in the gleaming floors, the organized shelves, the simmering pot on the stove. "I hope you don't mind," Eleanor replied. "I wanted to make myself useful." Mind, I haven't seen these floors shine since Clara left. He ran a hand through his hair, a hint of embarrassment in the gesture. I should warn you, though, you've set a dangerous precedent. I might get used to coming home to clean floors and cooking stew. The casual way he said home struck Eleanor. This place was his home, not just his house. There was a difference. One, she had recognized the moment she stepped inside. For all its comfortable furnishings, the Sullivan Ranch felt lived in, cared for. You had a visitor, she said, changing the subject. Garrett's expression immediately sobered. Mrs. Wilson. You were expecting her. It's Tuesday. She always brings the washing on Tuesdays. He studied Eleanor's face. She gave you the speech. About Clara's clothes, I take it, and implied I was setting you up to compromise your virtue. Eleanor couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips despite the awkwardness of the conversation. She did seem concerned. I apologize for her, Garrett said, his face flushing slightly. Sarah believes it's her Christian duty to protect me from designing women, real or imagined. It's all right, Eleanor assured him. I understand her concern. Do you? His gaze was direct, searching. A bachelor with a prosperous ranch, taking in a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. She shrugged slightly. I'd be suspicious too. I assured her our arrangement is temporary and strictly professional. I see. Was there a hint of disappointment in his voice, or was she imagining it? Well, I appreciate you handling her tactfully, he said after a moment. Sarah means well, but she can be overwhelming. She was actually quite helpful, Eleanor replied. She told me you prefer your shirts hung rather than folded when wet. Garrett laughed, the sound warming the room. She would focus on that. Sarah believes a man can be judged by the state of his shirts. The tension broken, they fell into companionable conversation as Eleanor finished preparing the meal, and Garrett set the table. He told her about the ranch, 5,000 acres, mostly devoted to cattle, with some horses and a small orchard. It's not the biggest operation in the county, he said, but it's productive. My father started it after moving west from Boston. I expanded it after I took over. You're from Boston? Eleanor asked, surprised at this connection to her own past. Born and raised, though you'd never know it now, he smiled ruefully. 20 years in Arizona tends to sand away the eastern edges. What made you stay? She asked, curious about the man whose home she had entered so unexpectedly. A shadow crossed his face. That's a long story, Miss Bennet. Perhaps for another time. She nodded, respecting his privacy. They all had parts of their past they preferred not to discuss immediately. What about you? Garrett asked, changing the subject. How did a Philadelphia seamstress end up answering a matrimonial advertisement in Arizona? Eleanor hesitated. Her story was a delicate one to tell, but after the kindness Garrett had shown her, she owed him honesty. I grew up in a respectable family, she began, choosing her words carefully. My father was a clerk at a bank, my mother a schoolteacher. They believed in education, even for daughters, so I attended school longer than most girls. She smoothed her skirt, a habit when speaking of personal matters. When I was 17, they both fell ill during an influenza outbreak. Within a week, I was alone in the world. I'm sorry, Garrett said quietly. Thank you. She acknowledged his sympathy with a slight nod. I was fortunate to have my skills as a seamstress. I secured a position with Mr. Blackwell, a tailor who had known my father. For 7 years I worked there, saving what I could, living modestly in a small apartment. She paused, the memory of what came next still raw. Then, last year, Mr. Blackwell sold his business to his nephew. The young man had modern ideas about the shop's image. He said customers didn't want to see a woman of my proportions working in a fashion establishment. Garrett's jaw tightened visibly, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. I tried to find other work, but doors kept closing. Shopkeeping, teaching, even factory work. Suddenly there were younger, slimmer girls who were deemed more suitable. The bitterness she'd kept contained for so long threatened to surface. I've always been bigger than other women. As a girl, I could tell myself it was just baby fat, something I would outgrow. As a woman, I learned society has little patience for those who don't conform to its narrow vision of beauty. Eleanor met Garrett's gaze directly. Then I saw Mr. Thornton's advertisement. He seemed kind in his letters, understanding. He wrote about building a life together, about wanting a companion who valued education and culture. I thought perhaps in a place where people were judged by their contribution, rather than their appearance. She trailed off, embarrassed by the naive hope that had led her across the country. You thought the West might be different, Garrett finished for her. Foolish, I know. Not foolish, he countered, just optimistic, and not entirely wrong. The West can be unforgiving, but it also offers second chances to those willing to work for them. His words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that extended beyond her immediate situation. After dinner, Garrett insisted on helping with the dishes despite Eleanor's protests. "I'm not an invalid," he said, with a self-deprecating smile. "Despite what Mrs. Wilson might think about my housekeeping abilities." Eleanor found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. "Well, if you insist on helping, I insist you dry. I've organized the cupboards, and I won't have you undoing my system." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the gentle domesticity of the task a balm after the chaos of the previous day. When the kitchen was clean, Garrett invited her to join him by the fire. "I usually read in the evenings," he explained, "but I'd welcome company if you're not too tired." "Neither were you," she retorted. "At least he's been honest from the start." "Honest?" Jackson barked a laugh. "Did he tell you why his sister left? Why half the town won't do business with him? Did he tell you about the Prescott land dispute?" Garrett moved with unexpected swiftness, grabbing Jackson by the front of his expensive coat. "That's enough, Thornton." The other men immediately tensed, hands moving to their weapons. The young deputy dismounted, his inexperience evident in his nervous demeanor. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to have to ask you to release Mr. Thornton," he said, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered pistol. For a moment, the tableau held, Garrett's knuckles white against Jackson's coat, the mounted men waiting for a signal, Eleanor frozen in place. Then Garrett released Jackson with a slight shove, stepping back. "Get off my property," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you." Jackson straightened his coat, a triumphant gleam in his eye. "Showing your true colors, Sullivan. Just like always." He turned to Eleanor. "When you tire of playing housekeeper, to a man with blood on his hands, Oakridge's charity isn't without limits. The church ladies might take pity on you." "I don't need pity," Eleanor said coldly. "Yours or theirs?" Jackson shrugged and remounted his horse. "Your choice, Miss Bennett. But don't say you weren't warned." He looked down at Garrett. "Town council meets Tuesday. Might be discussing water rights to that stream that feeds your south pasture. Shame if the vote went against you." With that parting threat, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his companions following. The young deputy lingered a moment, longer, looking uncomfortable. "No offense meant, Mr. Sullivan," he said quietly. "Just doing my job." "Your job is upholding the law, Parker, not being Thornton's puppet," Garrett replied. "Your father would be disappointed." The young man's face fell at that, and he mounted hastily, spurring his horse to catch up with the others. Silence descended as the dust from the rider's departure settled. Eleanor became aware of her trembling hands and clenched them to stop their movement. Garrett stood rigid, staring after the retreating figures, tension radiating from every line of his body. "Garrett," she said gently, using his given name deliberately to break through his anger. "What was that about?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was shuttered in a way it hadn't been since her arrival. You should probably start packing." The words struck like a physical blow. "What?" "Thornton won't stop." Garrett ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. "He'll make good on his threats, to me and to your reputation. Better if you leave now, get ahead of whatever story he's spinning in town." Eleanor stared at him, disbelieving. "You're sending me away?" "I'm trying to protect you," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "Thornton has influence. He can make life impossible for both of us if he chooses." "So we let him win?" Eleanor challenged. "I run away, proving whatever vile rumors he's spreading, and you—" "What? Lose your water access because you dared to help me?" Garrett's expression darkened. "It's more complicated than that." "Then explain it to me," she insisted. "What did he mean about your sister, about the Prescott property?" For a moment she thought he might refuse, then his shoulders sagged slightly. "Let's go inside. This isn't a conversation to have standing." "In the yard." In the house, Garrett poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept on a high shelf. He offered one to Eleanor, who accepted it without comment despite never having touched spirits before. They sat at the table, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the plank floor. "Clara left 6 months ago," Garrett began after a long silence. "She came to live with me after our mother died back east. She was 24, unmarried. I was the only family she had left." He took a small sip of his whiskey. "She is willful, idealistic, much like our mother had been." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to the story. Jackson Thornton was 34 then, already established in town. He started calling on Clara, brought her gifts, took her driving on Sundays. His knuckles whitened around his glass. I didn't trust him. His interest seemed calculated. Our father had left her a small inheritance to be managed by me until she turned 30, and Thornton knew this. Eleanor nodded, beginning to understand. I told Clara my concerns. She accused me of trying to control her life, of being jealous of Thornton's success. A muscle worked in his jaw. Then one night, she didn't come home. I found her at Thornton's. Ranch distraught. She wouldn't tell me what happened, but she never spoke to him again. "He hurt her," Eleanor said softly. "It wasn't a question. In some way, yes. But she wouldn't say how, and I couldn't prove anything." Garrett's eyes darkened with old rage. "A week later, she announced she was going to San Francisco to stay with our aunt." "You tried to convince her to stay," Eleanor finished for him. "Yes. But she needed to get away from the memories, from the town's gossip. And Thornton spread rumors," Eleanor surmised, piecing together the story. Garrett took another sip of whiskey. "He implied I had driven her away out of jealousy, that I was controlling her inheritance for my own gain. It divided the town, those who believed him and those who knew me better." Eleanor thought of Sarah Wilson's protective visit, of the way some townspeople seemed wary of Garrett, while others, like the deputy's father, apparently respected him. And the Prescott property? What was that about? Garrett's expression grew more troubled. Joseph Prescott owned the property bordering mine to the east, good water access, excellent grazing land. He was an old man, lived alone. We were friends, of a sort. He had no family. He rose and moved to the window, staring out at the land as if seeing the past play out before him. "Prescott died suddenly. Heart failure," the doctor said. "In his will, he left his property to me." Garrett turned back to face her. Thornton had been courting him as well, bringing him into town for council meetings, offering to buy his land. When the will was read, Thornton accused me of coercion, even suggesting I might have had something to do with Prescott's death. "That's absurd," Eleanor gasped. "Surely no one believed that." "Some did. Enough to create doubt." Garrett returned to the table but didn't sit. The will stood. It was properly executed, witnessed by the town judge. But Thornton has been working against me ever since, blocking cattle sales, interfering with water rights, turning opinion against me wherever he can. And now he sees me as another weapon to use against you, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. Precisely. Garrett returned to the table but didn't sit. So you see why it might be better if you left, not just for your sake, but for mine as well. Eleanor considered his words carefully. She had come to Arizona seeking security, a place to belong. Instead, she had walked into a years-long feud and now found herself being used as a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen to play. The practical choice would be to leave, to take what little money she had earned and make her way to Phoenix as planned, start fresh, where neither Jackson's rejection nor Garrett's complicated past could touch her. But something in her rebelled at the thought. Running away had never been her nature, even when staying meant hardship. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked quietly. Garrett looked startled. "Did you not hear what I just told you? Thornton will do whatever he plans. To do regardless," she interrupted. "My leaving won't stop his vendetta against you. It will only prove he has the power to disrupt your life whenever he chooses." "And what about your reputation? The gossip?" Eleanor gave a small, bitter laugh. "My reputation was compromised the moment I stepped off that train, Mr. Sullivan. I was judged and found wanting before I spoke a single word to Jackson Thornton." She met his gaze steadily. "I didn't let his rejection define me then. I won't. Let his threats define me now." Garrett studied her face, something like admiration flickering in his blue eyes. "You're not what I expected, Eleanor Bennett." "No," she agreed with a slight smile. "I imagine not." He returned to his seat, considering. "If you stay, it won't be easy. Thornton has a long reach in this county." "Few worthwhile things in life are easy," she replied. "But I won't stay where I'm not wanted. If you truly believe my presence endangers your ranch or your standing—" "It's not that," Garrett said quickly. "Your presence has been—" he searched for the right word— "valuable." The simple acknowledgement warmed her more than it should have. "Then I'll stay. At least until our 2 weeks are concluded, as agreed." She straightened her shoulders. "And I'll face whatever Jackson Thornton chooses to throw at us." Garrett nodded slowly. "All right, but we'll need to be careful. Thornton doesn't make idle threats." "Neither do I," Eleanor said with quiet determination. "And I've survived worse than a small-town bully with an inflated sense of importance." A rare smile curved Garrett's lips. "I believe you have." He raised his glass slightly, to standing firm. Eleanor lifted her own glass, the amber liquid catching the late afternoon light. "To standing firm." They drank, the whiskey burning a path down Eleanor's throat and settling warmly in her stomach. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, bathing the land in golden light. The day's confrontation had changed something between them, a shared adversary, creating an unexpected alliance. Eleanor knew staying was risky. Jackson's veiled accusations in the deputy's presence had made that clear, but running had never solved her problems before, and she doubted it would now. Better to face whatever came next with dignity and resolve, and if part of her decision to stay stemmed from a growing attachment to this place and the man across from her, well, that was a complication she would examine another day. The next. Morning dawned clear and cool, with no sign of the previous day's tensions. Eleanor rose early, determined to maintain their established routine, despite Jackson's ominous visit. She was mixing dough for breakfast biscuits when a sharp knock at the door startled her. Garrett emerged from his room, already dressed, but with his shirt only half-buttoned. "Stay back," he warned, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted near. "The door." "Garrett," she protested, but he had already opened the door, rifle held casually but ready. Instead of Jackson or his men, however, A young boy of perhaps 12 stood on the porch, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Got a telegram for Mr. Sullivan," the boy announced, holding out a yellow envelope. "Mr. Peterson at the office said it was urgent." Garrett lowered the rifle and took the telegram, fishing in his pocket for a coin, which he tossed to the boy. "Thanks, Jimmy. Tell your pa I said hello." The boy nodded, pocketed the coin, and raced back to his waiting pony. Eleanor watched as Garrett opened the envelope, his expression growing more troubled as he read its contents. "Bad news?" she asked when he finally looked up from the paper. "From my sister," he replied, his voice tense. "She's coming home, arriving on tomorrow's stage." Eleanor wasn't sure why this would be cause for concern. "Isn't that good news?" Under normal circumstances, yes. He handed her the telegram. But her timing couldn't be worse. Eleanor read the brief message, "Arriving tomorrow's afternoon stage. Stop urgent matters to discuss sorry. For short notice, all will be explained, Clara." "I don't understand," Eleanor said, returning the telegram. "Why is this a problem?" "Because Clara hasn't been back to Oakridge since the incident with Thornton. Because she knows nothing about you, and because urgent matters from my sister has never meant anything good." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "You think this has something to do with Thornton? I think it's too much of a coincidence that she's returning now, immediately after Thornton made his threats." Garrett folded the telegram and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Whatever the reason, we need to prepare. Clara can be difficult." "I should leave before she arrives," Eleanor said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "It would be easier for you both." "What happened to standing firm?" Garrett looked at her sharply. "That was before your sister's impending arrival." She pointed out, "I won't come between family, Garrett." "You're not," he insisted. "Clara left of her own accord. And whatever her urgent matters are, they won't change the fact that you have a place here for as long as you need it." The conviction in his voice touched her deeply. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He moved closer, stopping just short of touching her. "Eleanor, I meant what I said yesterday. Your presence here has been valuable, more than I expected." There was something in his eyes, something beyond the simple appreciation of an employer for a competent housekeeper, something that made her heart beat faster and her cheeks warm. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Then Garrett stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should ride into town, see if I can learn anything more about Clara's return. Maybe talk to Judge Morris about Thornton's threats." Eleanor nodded, both disappointed and relieved by the return. "To practicalities. I'll have dinner ready when you return, and I'll prepare the spare room for your sister." "You're sleeping in the spare room," Garrett pointed out. "I can make up a bed in the storage room," she replied. "It's small, but it will suffice for a few nights." Garrett frowned. "That won't be necessary. Clara can take my room. I'll sleep in the barn until we sort things out." "But it's decided," he said firmly. "I won't have you sleeping in a storage closet when there's a perfectly good bed available." Eleanor recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and conceded with a nod. "Very well, but I'll still prepare your room for her arrival." "Thank you." He reached for his hat and coat. "I won't be long." And Garrett, he paused at the door. "Don't worry about Clara or Thornton. We'll weather this storm together." With that promise hanging in the air, he departed, leaving Eleanor alone, with her thoughts and the dough still waiting to be shaped into biscuits. She returned to her task, her mind spinning with possibilities and concerns. Whatever storm was gathering on the horizon, she had made her choice to stand firm beside Garrett. Sullivan. Now she would have to face the consequences, be they Clara's arrival, Jackson's malice, or the growing feeling she could no longer ignore. Eleanor rose before dawn on the day of Clara's arrival, unable to sleep with anxiety twisting in her stomach. She moved quietly through the dimly lit house, careful not to wake Garrett, who had returned late from town the previous evening with a troubled expression and little information. She lit the stove and began preparations for a substantial breakfast, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of cooking. By the time sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, she had fresh bread cooling on the counter, eggs and bacon ready to cook, and coffee brewing. Garrett emerged from his room, his hair still damp from washing. He paused in the doorway, watching her work. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble," he said. Eleanor glanced up, offering a small smile. "It helps me think, and we should both eat well before—" She trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. Garrett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little." She turned her attention back to the eggs, sizzling in the pan. "Did you learn anything useful in town?" "Not about Clara." He moved to pour them both coffee. "But Thornton's been busy. Called a special meeting of the town council for this afternoon. Topic listed as moral concerns within the community." Eleanor's hand faltered slightly as she served. "The eggs." "He's not wasting any time." "No," Garrett agreed grimly. "He never does." They ate in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor used the time to study Garrett's face, the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. In just over a week, this man had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The thought of causing him additional difficulty with the town or his sister weighed heavily on her conscience. "I could still go," she said quietly, setting down her fork. "Take the morning stage to Phoenix. Be gone before Clara arrives." Garrett's gaze snapped to hers. "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted, "but it might be the simplest solution. Simple isn't always right." He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "Eleanor, I won't force you to stay in a difficult situation. If you want to leave, I'll understand. But don't do it just to spare me complications with Clara or Thornton." The conviction in his voice steadied her. "All right, I'll stay, at least until we see what Clara's visit entails." Relief flashed across his features. "Good. And Eleanor, thank you for the breakfast, for everything you've done here." There was a warmth in his words that sent a flutter through her chest. But before she could respond, the sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. Garrett rose and moved to the window. "It's Henry," he reported, referring to the ranch hand, who came 3 times a week to help with the heavier work. Earlier than usual, Eleanor cleared their plates as Garrett went to meet Henry. Through the open window, she could hear fragments of their conversation. "Telegraph from Morris," Henry was saying. "Water board inspection coming tomorrow." "Thornton's work," Garrett replied, his voice hard. "Right on schedule." Eleanor couldn't make out Henry's response, but Garrett's voice rose slightly. "They won't find anything irregular. We've always played by the rules." She was wiping down the table when Garrett returned, tension radiating from his tall frame. "Problem?" she asked. "Just Thornton pulling strings," he replied, jaw tight. "The Territorial Water Board suddenly needs to examine our property boundaries. Coincidental timing, wouldn't you say?" "Very," she agreed. "Is it serious?" "Could be. The stream access he's challenging provides water for half my cattle. He's trying to claim it should belong to the Prescott property, which would mean it's up for renegotiation." He ran a hand through his hair. "If they restrict our access or rule against our claim." He didn't need to finish. Eleanor had learned enough about ranching to understand that water rights could make or break an operation, especially with winter approaching. "What can I do to help?" she asked simply. Garrett's expression softened. "Just having someone else to shoulder this is—" He paused, seeming surprised by his own admission. "It helps." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Then Garrett cleared his throat. "I should check the property markers before the stage arrives. Make sure everything's in order for tomorrow's inspection." Of course, Eleanor nodded. I'll finish preparing for Clara's arrival. After Garrett departed, Eleanor threw herself into work with renewed determination. She swept and dusted Garrett's bedroom, putting fresh linens on the bed and arranging wildflowers on the dresser. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until it gleamed, polished the stove to a shine, and put a stew on to simmer for dinner. Physical labor helped keep her anxiety at bay, but as midday approached, her nerves returned in full force. What kind of woman was Clara Sullivan? Would she resent Eleanor's presence in her childhood home? And what urgent matter had brought her back to a place that held such painful memories? The answers would have to wait. Garrett returned from his property inspection just as the clock struck 2. He changed quickly into a clean shirt and joined Eleanor in the main room. The stage should arrive around 3, he said, his typical composure betrayed by the way he repeatedly checked his pocket watch. We should head into town. Eleanor smoothed her dress. One of Clara's old ones that Sarah Wilson had altered to fit her fuller figure. Do you want me to come with you? Perhaps it would be better if I stayed here. No, Garrett said decisively. Better to face this head-on. Clara will hear about you regardless. Better she meets you properly than relies on town gossip. The ride into town passed in tense silence. Eleanor couldn't help noticing how different this journey felt from her first arrival in Oakridge. Then she had been full of hope, imagining a future with a man she had never met. Now she rode beside a man she had come to admire deeply, uncertain what the coming hours would bring. Oakridge looked much as Eleanor remembered it, dusty, sparse, with the same sense of frontier impermanence. But this time she noticed how heads turned as they passed, how conversations halted and eyes followed their progress down the main street. Jackson Thornton's influence at work, no doubt. They tethered the wagon near the stage depot, a simple, wooden structure with a bench outside where passengers could wait for departures. Several townspeople milled about, ostensibly on afternoon errands, but clearly interested in the arrival of both the stage and Garrett Sullivan, with the mysterious woman who had been staying at his ranch. Garrett offered his arm as they crossed to the depot, a public declaration that Eleanor was under his protection. She accepted it gratefully, holding her head high despite the whispers that followed them. "Quite the audience," she murmured. "Small towns," Garrett replied, echoing his words from days earlier. "Not much stays secret for long." They took a position slightly apart from the others, Garrett's posture alert but outwardly calm. Only the tightness around his eyes betrayed his tension. The wait seemed interminable. Eleanor found herself studying the faces around them, wondering which belonged to Thornton's allies and which might be neutral or even sympathetic to Garrett's position. She spotted Deputy Parker lounging against a hitching post nearby, clearly assigned to observe them. Finally, the distant rumble of wheels and a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the stage's approach. Eleanor felt Garrett stiffen beside her, his arm tensing under her hand. "It will be all right," she said quietly, surprising herself with the assurance. Garrett glanced down at her, a flicker of gratitude in his blue eyes. "Let's hope so." The stagecoach rattled to a stop in a cloud of dust and commotion. The driver secured the team while the attendant opened the door for the passengers. A traveling salesman with a sample case disembarked first, followed by an older gentleman who was greeted enthusiastically by a woman Eleanor assumed was his wife. Then a slender figure appeared in the doorway, pausing to survey the gathered crowd. Even from a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable. The same straight nose and determined chin as Garrett, though on a decidedly feminine face, framed by auburn hair, styled in the latest fashion. She wore a traveling suit of deep blue, the quality of the fabric. Speaking of city prosperity, Clara Sullivan had returned to Oakridge, and she looked nothing like the heartbroken girl who had fled 6 months earlier. "Garrett!" she called, her voice clear and steady. Garrett moved forward, Eleanor a half step behind. Clara, brother and sister, stood facing each other for a moment, the tension almost palpable. Then Clara smiled, a small tentative thing, and Garrett pulled her into a brief, awkward embrace. "You look well," he said as they separated. "So do you," she replied, her gaze shifting to Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "And who might this be?" Garrett straightened. "Clara, this is Miss Eleanor Bennett. She's been staying at the ranch this past week. Eleanor, my sister, Clara Sullivan." Eleanor extended her hand, determined to make a good impression despite her nerves. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Sullivan. Your brother has spoken highly of you." Clara's handshake was firm, her assessment frank and unabashed. "Has he? How interesting. Garrett rarely speaks highly of anyone." She turned back to her brother. "My trunk should be on top. I assume you brought the wagon." "Of course," Garrett replied, moving to help the driver unload her luggage. Left alone with Clara, Eleanor maintained her composure despite the younger woman's continued scrutiny. "I've prepared your old room for you," she offered. "I hope you'll find everything to your satisfaction." "My old room," Clara repeated, something unreadable in her tone. "And where are you sleeping, Miss Bennett?" The question's implication was clear. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Your brother has been kind enough to offer me the spare room while I'm employed as his housekeeper." "Housekeeper?" Clara echoed, arching one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "How convenient for both of you." Before Eleanor could respond, Garrett returned with Clara's trunk secured on his shoulder. "Everything's loaded. We should get back to the ranch before dark." The ride home was strained, with Clara seated between them on the wagon bench. She made polite inquiries about the ranch and the town, but avoided any mention of why she had returned so suddenly or what urgent matters she needed to discuss. As they passed the turnoff to the Thornton property, Clara stiffened visibly. "Is he still on the town council?" she asked, breaking a lengthy silence. Garrett nodded grimly. "And gaining influence by the day." Clara's delicate jaw tightened, a gesture so reminiscent of her brother that Eleanor couldn't help but notice the family resemblance despite their different coloring. "Some things never change." "And some do," Garrett replied, his tone gentle but firm. "You're not 24 anymore, Clara, and this isn't the same town you left." "No," she agreed, her gaze sliding briefly to Eleanor. "It certainly isn't." The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Clara surveyed the property as they approached, her expression softening slightly. "You've kept it up," she observed. "The garden looks better than when I left." "That's Eleanor's doing," Garrett said. "She's got a way with growing things." Clara glanced at Eleanor with renewed interest. "Is that so? I could never get anything to thrive in this soil." "The soil or you?" Garrett asked, a hint of their old relationship surfacing in the gentle teasing. "Both," Clara admitted with a small smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to strikingly beautiful. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, the stew Eleanor had prepared filling the air with savory aromas. Clara paused in the doorway, taking in the polished surfaces, the fresh flowers, the general air of care that had been lacking during her last residence. "It feels different," she said quietly. "Less empty," Garrett supplied. Clara nodded, then turned to Eleanor. "You've done more than tend the garden, it seems." "I enjoy creating a comfortable home," Eleanor replied simply. "Your brother has been very kind to give me the opportunity." Clara studied her thoughtfully, then seemed to come to some decision. "I imagine you're both curious about why I've returned so suddenly." Garrett gestured to the table. "Let's eat first. Then we can talk." The meal passed pleasantly enough, with Clara sharing stories of her life in San Francisco, where she had apparently secured a position as a clerk in a law office. "Not the usual employment for a woman," she admitted, But Judge Franklin, Aunt Martha's neighbor, took an interest in my education, said I had a mind for details. You always did, Garrett agreed. Even as a child, you noticed everything. A shadow crossed Clara's face. Not everything, not when it mattered. The mood shifted perceptibly. Eleanor rose to clear the plates, offering them privacy, but Clara stopped her with a raised hand. Please stay, Miss Bennet. What I have to say concerns you as well, in a way. Eleanor resumed her seat, exchanging a puzzled glance with Garrett. Clara took a deep breath. I received a letter from Sarah Wilson 3 days ago. She mentioned that Garrett had taken in a woman, a mail-order bride, rejected by Jackson Thornton, and that Thornton was using it to renew his campaign against the ranch. Garrett's expression hardened. Sarah should mind her own business. She was concerned, Clara countered, and rightly so. Thornton never needs much excuse to cause trouble. And you rushed back from San Francisco because of town gossip? Garrett asked skeptically. Clara hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded document. No, I came back because of this. She placed the paper on the table and smoothed it flat. Eleanor could see it was a legal document of some kind, with official seals and signatures at the bottom. What is it? Garrett asked, reaching for the paper. A notice of intent to claim, Clara replied. Thornton is petitioning the territorial court to invalidate Joseph Prescott's will on grounds of undue influence. He's making another play for the Prescott property and, by extension, control of the water rights to half your ranch. Garrett scanned the document, his expression growing darker with each line. He can't do this. The will was properly executed, witnessed by Judge Morris himself. Judge Morris is retiring next month, Clara pointed out. His replacement is a man named Harrison, recently arrived from St. Louis and, coincidentally, a former business associate of Thornton's father. Convenient timing, Eleanor observed quietly. Very, Clara agreed. Just as it's convenient that Thornton suddenly has a witness claiming to have overheard Prescott complaining that Garrett was pressuring him about the will. That's a lie, Garrett growled. Joseph was my friend. He left me that land because he didn't want Thornton turning it into another showcase for his ego. I believe you, Clara assured him, but it's your word against their fabricated witness, and with your current situation... She glanced meaningfully at Eleanor. My situation has nothing to do with this, Garrett snapped. Clara leaned forward, her expression earnest. Garrett, I know you believe that, but Thornton is using Miss Bennet's presence here to paint you as morally compromised. He's telling people that if you'd take advantage of a vulnerable woman, you'd certainly take advantage of an elderly neighbor. Eleanor felt as if she'd been struck. That's why you came back, she said softly. To warn Garrett that I'm endangering his claim to the Prescott property. Clara had the grace to look uncomfortable, partly, but also because I know Thornton. I know how he operates, how he twists the truth to suit his purposes. Her voice hardened, and I owe him some justice of my own. Garrett reached across the table to grasp his sister's hand. Clara, whatever happened between you and Thornton? No, she cut him off sharply. We're not discussing that, not now. She withdrew her hand and turned to Eleanor. Miss Bennet, I apologize if I seemed cold earlier. I needed to assess the situation for myself, to understand what kind of woman would choose to stay in such a complicated arrangement. And have. You made your assessment? Eleanor asked, meeting her gaze steadily. A hint of respect flickered in Clara's eyes. I believe I have. You're either very brave or very desperate. Perhaps both. Clara, Garrett warned. It's all right, Eleanor assured him. She faced Clara directly. I was desperate when I arrived in Oak Ridge. I had nowhere to go, no means to support myself. Your brother offered me shelter and honest work when Jackson Thornton offered only Humiliation. I stayed because it seemed the best option available to me. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But I won't stay if my presence jeopardizes your brother's property or standing. Clara studied her thoughtfully. Noble sentiment, but it may be too late for that. Thornton has already set his plan in motion. Then we fight back, Garrett declared. I won't let him steal land that rightfully belongs to this ranch. And I won't send Eleanor away just because it might look better to some territorial judge. It's not that simple, Clara argued. Thornton has connections, money, influence, and now he has a legal strategy that might actually work. What do you suggest then? Garrett demanded. Clara hesitated, glancing between them. There is one option that would neutralize part of his argument, a way to remove the question of impropriety. Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, suddenly understanding where Clara was heading. Miss Bennet could leave, Clara continued, confirming Eleanor's suspicion. Return east or continue to Phoenix as she planned. With her gone, Thornton loses one of his weapons against you. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Eleanor stared at her folded hands, emotions warring within her. The logical part of her knew Clara was right. Her departure would simplify Garrett's legal battle. But the thought of leaving, of never seeing him again, created an unexpected ache in her chest. Garrett's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and controlled. That's not an option, Clara sighed. Garrett, be reasonable. I said no, he interrupted, an edge of steel in his tone. Eleanor stays if she wishes to stay. I won't have Thornton dictating who can live under my roof. Even if it costs you half your water rights. Even if it means financial ruin, Clara challenged. Yes, Garrett said simply. The single word hung in the air between them. Eleanor looked up, meeting Garrett's gaze across the table. What she saw there, determination, protectiveness, and something deeper she hardly dared name, stole her breath. There must be another way, she said softly. Clara watched the exchange, her expression shifting from frustration to thoughtful consideration. Perhaps there is, she said slowly. A different solution entirely. Garrett turned to his sister. What are you thinking? A calculating smile spread across Clara's face. I'm thinking that Thornton's entire argument hinges on the impropriety of your living arrangement, on the suggestion that you're a man of questionable character who takes advantage of vulnerable situations. Yes, Garrett agreed impatiently. We've established that. So we remove that argument, Clara continued, not by sending Miss Bennet away, but by changing the nature of her presence here. Eleanor frowned. I don't understand. Clara's smile widened. It's quite simple, really. If the concern is a single woman living unchaperoned with a bachelor, Clara, Garrett warned, beginning to see where she was heading, then the solution is to ensure she's no longer a single woman living with a bachelor. Clara finished triumphantly. You should marry her, Garrett, Eleanor gasped, heat flooding her cheeks. That's absurd, Garrett finished for her, though his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's face. Why not? Clara pressed. It solves the immediate problem. Thornton can't claim impropriety if you're legally wed. The court would view it as a legitimate marriage rather than a questionable arrangement, and it strengthens your position as a stable, respectable rancher committed to building a life here. You're suggesting we marry for convenience, Garrett stated flatly, to outmaneuver Thornton. I'm suggesting you consider all options, Clara countered, including ones that might benefit you both beyond the immediate crisis. Eleanor found her voice at last. Miss Sullivan, while I appreciate your creative thinking, marriage is hardly a solution to be proposed so casually. Your brother and I barely know each other. You know each other better than most couples who enter arranged marriages, Clara pointed out. You've lived under the same roof, shared meals, faced a common enemy. That's more than many have when They wed. She leaned forward. And don't tell me there's nothing between you. I've seen how you look at each other. Clara. Enough, Garrett said sharply. This is not a decision to be made tonight over dinner, under duress. His sister sat back, unperturbed by his tone. Of course not. I'm merely presenting an option. She rose from the table. It's been a long day, and I'm tired from my journey. We can discuss strategies further in the morning. With that, she bid them good night and retired to Garrett's room, leaving Eleanor and Garrett alone in a silence charged with unspoken thoughts. I apologize for my sister, Garrett said finally. She's always been direct. It's often hard to tell the difference between help and meddling with Clara. Eleanor began, gathering the dishes, needing physical activity to settle her nerves. She's right about one thing. My presence here complicates your situation with Thornton and the property claim. Garrett joined her at the wash basin, taking a dish to dry. My situation with Thornton was complicated long before you arrived, Eleanor. Don't take that burden on yourself. They worked in silence for a few moments, the simple domestic task a counterpoint to the turmoil of emotions between them. What are you thinking? Garrett asked quietly. Eleanor set down the last plate carefully. I'm thinking that I came to Arizona seeking security and found chaos instead. I'm thinking that I've brought difficulty to a man who showed me nothing but kindness. She turned to face him. And I'm thinking that your sister's suggestion, while shocking, is not as absurd as it perhaps should be. Garrett's eyes widened slightly. Eleanor, not because of Thornton or the property, she continued quickly, but because, she faltered, courage failing her. Because? He prompted gently. Because in less than 2 weeks, this place has begun to feel like home, she admitted softly. And you have become important to me. Garrett stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. You've become important to me too, Eleanor. More than I expected, more than might be wise given the circumstances. The quiet confession hung between them, neither quite ready to reach for what it offered. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the windows as if nature itself was unsettled by the evening's revelations. Oh, we should sleep, Eleanor said finally. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Garrett nodded, though he made no move to step away. Whatever we decide, Eleanor, know this. I won't let Thornton drive you away unless that's what you truly want. Not for my property, not for my reputation, not for anything. The conviction in his voice wrapped around her like a blanket against the night's chill. Thank you, she whispered. He reached out then, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was fleeting, yet it lingered on her skin like a promise. Good night, Eleanor, he said quietly. Good night, Garrett, she replied, her voice steady despite the tumult within. As she prepared for bed in the spare room, Eleanor's mind whirled with the day's events. Clara's return, the threat to Garrett's property, and most unsettling of all, the suggestion of marriage, a solution that should have seemed preposterous, but instead had planted a seed of possibility in her heart. Tomorrow she would need to make a choice, stay and fight alongside Garrett, whatever form that might take, or leave and remove herself as a weapon Thornton could use against him. Neither option was without cost, neither path guaranteed happiness or security. But for the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, Eleanor Bennett faced her uncertain future, not with fear, but with a flickering flame of hope that refused to be extinguished. And perhaps that, more than anything else, was what she had truly been seeking all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.